There's a photograph on the wall of my office that I've been staring at for the better part of 3 years now, and I still don't know what to do with it. It's a wide shot of a clearing in the Bitterroot Range, taken in the middle of the afternoon, the kind of light that doesn't lie, gold coming in low through the larch trees, every needle on every branch picked out sharp. In the foreground, there's a stump where I'd set my pack down for lunch. In the background, maybe 40 yards out, between two fir trees, there's a shape that shouldn't be in the photo, because when I took the photo, nothing was there. I would swear that on every Bible in the state of Montana. I lifted the camera, I looked through the viewfinder at an empty patch of forest. I pressed the shutter, I lowered the camera, the forest was still empty. I did not see anything in the clearing. I was alone. I'd been alone for 2 days. The shape in the photograph is tall, taller than the trees around it would suggest a man should be. And it's standing on 2 legs, and the head is wrong. That's the only word I have for the head. It is wrong. The proportions of it, the way it sits forward on the neck, the way the muzzle, and I have to call it a muzzle, extends out beyond where a human face would end. I've shown that photo to exactly 2 people in my life. One of them was my supervisor, a woman who has been in this job longer than I've been alive. And after she looked at it for about 30 seconds, she handed my phone back to me, and she said, very quietly, "Take that off your phone. Don't tell anyone you have it. Do you understand?" I said I did. The other person was a wildlife biologist out of Missoula, and he looked at it longer, and what he said was, "Where was this taken? Exactly where?" And when I told him, he didn't say anything else for almost a full minute. And then he said, "Don't go back there alone. I'm a backcountry ranger. Lolo National Forest, Seasonal Search and Rescue Auxiliary, that's my title on the paperwork. $26 an hour, plus per diem, plus a housing stipend for the field months. The real job, the one you actually do, is you live out of a truck and a tent and a cabin depending on where the rotation puts you, and you walk the trails nobody else wants to walk, and when somebody doesn't come back, you go find them. That's the whole thing. 11 years I'd been doing it when this happened. 11 years of pulling lost hunters out of drainages, dragging hypothermic backpackers down off the ridges, finding the occasional body that the bears had gotten to before we did. I'd seen things, sure. Everyone in this job sees things. You see what a black bear does to a tent when there's a Snickers bar in it. You see what happens to a man who tries to ford the Bitterroot in late May. You see the small private rooms people make for themselves out in the woods when they decide they're done. None of it was what I'd call supernatural. It was just nature, doing what nature does, and people, doing what people do. I'm telling you that part first so you understand. I wasn't the guy who saw signs. I wasn't the guy who read cryptid forums on his phone in his bunk. The other rangers had a name for the type. We called them the Bigfoot guys, and I was not one of them. I want that on the record before I tell you the rest, because the rest is going to sound like I am one. I'm not. I'm a guy who knows what tracks look like and what they don't. I'm a guy who took a photograph of an empty clearing and found a tall standing shape in it when he looked at the screen, and who has been trying, since that afternoon in October of 2022, to figure out how to live with what was already in the frame. October 9th, 2022. I remember the date because it was 3 days after my daughter's birthday, and I was supposed to call her, and I forgot. And that's the kind of detail that sticks. The call came in around 4 in the afternoon. A man named Caleb Resnick, 26, solo camper, hadn't come back from a 4-day trip into the Welcome Creek wilderness. His sister had called it in. Her name was Hannah Resnick, 29, a veterinary technician at a clinic on Reserve Street in Missoula. She'd driven up to the trailhead herself before calling us, because she'd had a feeling, she said, the way you get a feeling about a horse before it founders. She told me later that she and Caleb had grown up the way some siblings do, with that radio between them, and that the radio had gone quiet at some point Saturday night, and she'd known. She hadn't been able to explain it to her boyfriend or her mother, but she'd known. He was supposed to be home Sunday night. This was Tuesday afternoon, and his car was still at the trailhead. The sister had driven up from Missoula and confirmed it. Silver Subaru, locked, his hiking pole leaning against the bumper like he'd set it down for a second and was coming right back. The Welcome Creek wilderness isn't huge, about 28,000 acres, but it's steep and the drainages are tight, and the trail system is mostly creek bottoms and ridge spines with not a lot in between. If you go off trail, you can get into trouble fast. A couple years before that, we'd pulled a guy out of there who'd broken his ankle on a side slope and crawled half a mile before he gave up and just waited. Took us a day and a half to find him because he was about 200 yards off a trail we'd walked twice. I drew the assignment with a younger ranger named Pete Halverson. Pete was 28, 4 seasons in, a good kid, the kind of guy who took the job seriously without making it his whole personality. We staged at the Welcome Creek trailhead by 6 that evening. Sunset was around 7. The plan was we'd push in about 2 miles before full dark, set up at the first established camp spot, and start a real search at first light. Standard procedure. You don't search at night unless you have to, because at night you're just adding bodies to the count. The trailhead parking lot is a gravel turnaround about the size of a high school basketball court, surrounded on 3 sides by lodgepole pine that comes right up to the edge. Resnick's Subaru was there, just like the sister said. We did a quick check of it, looked through the windows for anything obvious, a map, a note, a journal. Nothing. The hiking pole was leaning against the back bumper. Pete pointed it out. "That's weird, right?" he said. "What's weird about it? You don't leave your pole. You either take both or you put them both back in the car." I looked at it. He was right. It was a small thing, the kind of thing that doesn't mean anything until later, and then it does. We shouldered our packs and started up the trail. The Welcome Creek Trail follows the creek for about 3 miles before it starts to climb, and that first stretch is easy walking, pine duff underfoot. The creek to your right, the sound of it loud enough that you have to raise your voice a little if you want to be heard. It was full dusk by the time we'd gone a mile, and the temperature was dropping fast, the way it does in the Bitterroots in October. Probably 38 degrees when we left the truck, probably 28 by the time we made camp. We picked a spot at a wide bend in the creek where there was a fire ring from previous campers and enough flat ground for our tents. Pete had a jet boil going for noodles before I'd even gotten my poles staked out. We ate. We talked about the search pattern for the morning. We didn't talk about Resnick because there was nothing to say about him yet. He was a name and an age and a missing car. We'd put a face to him when we found him. That was the plan anyway. I woke up at, I want to say, 11 or so. I don't sleep deep in the field, none of us do, but this wasn't the usual thing of waking up because a branch fell or a deer walked through camp. This was waking up because something was wrong with the sound. I lay there in my bag for a minute, trying to figure out what it was, and then I got it. The creek was still going, you could hear it, but everything else was gone. No wind in the pines, no small movement in the duff, no owl, the little night sounds of a forest doing its normal forest things. All of it gone. Just the creek and the inside my head sound of my own pulse. I'd been in that forest 100 times. I'd never heard it that quiet. I sat up in my bag and listened. After maybe 2 minutes, the wind came back, a small gust through the tops of the pines, and a few seconds after that, I heard a single owl, the 4-note call of a great horned, way off down the drainage. Things resumed. Whatever had stopped them, stopped being there, and the forest started up again. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself a coyote had moved through and put a hush on things, and then moved out. That happens. I lay back down. I didn't sleep again for a while, but I lay there. The thing I keep coming back to about that first night, when I think about it now, is the smell. I didn't register it at the time because I was half asleep and trying to figure out the silence. But it was there, underneath everything. A wet, warm smell, the kind you get when you walk past an old dog kennel that hasn't been cleaned in a few days, but with something else underneath it that I couldn't place. Not rot, not anything dead. More like the smell you get when you open up a root cellar that's been closed up all winter. That mushroomy soil and stone smell that means something has been living in there even when nobody knew it was. It was faint, and it came in on whatever air had been displaced when the silence happened, and it was gone again with the wind. I noticed it without noticing it, the way your brain logs the smell of gas in a house before you've consciously identified what's wrong. By morning, I'd forgotten about it. It came back to me later. A lot of things came back to me later. Pete didn't wake up. I know because I asked him in the morning, casually, if he'd slept all right. And he said he'd slept like a rock. He had no idea anything had happened. That was the first piece of information I filed away that I didn't know what to do with. The fact that whatever it was had passed close enough to put a hush on a forest the size of the Welcome Creek drainage. And Pete, 10 feet from me in a tent of identical construction, hadn't stirred. Either I'm a lighter sleeper than he is, which is true, or whatever woke me did so on purpose. I am 61 years old, and I have spent a long time being careful about which of those two explanations I lean on, but lately, the older I get, the more I lean on the second one. The first light at that elevation in October comes around 6:30. We were up before it. Coffee, oatmeal, packed by 7. The search plan was to push up the main trail to where it splits at Cinnabar Creek. Then I'd take the South Fork and Pete would take the North, and we'd meet at a saddle about 4 miles in by mid-afternoon. We had radios, we had bear spray, we had everything you're supposed to have. The first sign I found was about 1.5 miles past the split on the South Fork Trail. It was a wrapper, a Cliff Bar wrapper, the white chocolate macadamia kind, lying in the trail about 10 feet off path in a clump of huckleberry. Not weathered, the print on it was still bright. I bagged it and marked the GPS coordinates and radioed Pete to log it. A 1/4 mile further, I found a depression in the duff where somebody had sat down. You can tell when it's recent because the needles aren't fully sprung back. Someone had sat there facing the creek, and there was a small pile of pistachio shells next to where their right hand would have been. I bagged a few of the shells. Pistachios go with the wrapper, in the sense that a guy on a long hike eats whatever's in his pack and doesn't always pack it out the way he should. I was building a picture. Resnick had been here. He'd been here recently. He'd been heading up the South Fork. The third sign was the one that started to make me wonder. About a 1/2 mile past the sit-down spot, the trail crosses Cinnabar Creek on a series of flat rocks. On the far side of the crossing, in a patch of soft mud where the bank rises up out of the water, there were boot prints. Vibram tread, size 11 or 12, headed up the trail. Resnick's almost certainly. And next to the boot prints, paralleling them about 3 feet off to the side, were tracks I couldn't immediately place. I'm gonna be precise about this part because the precision is the whole point. The tracks were canid in the general shape. 4 toes, claws registering. The pad arrangement was wrong for a cat. But the size was wrong for a coyote, and the splay was wrong for a wolf. A big wolf track, a real big one, will run you about 5 inches long and 4 wide. These were closer to 7 inches long. The depth was wrong, too. The boot prints next to them were pressed maybe a 1/4 inch into the mud. The other tracks were pressed close to 1 inch. Whatever made them was heavy. Heavier than Resnick by a lot. And Resnick, based on the boot size, was probably 180, 190. I took photos. I took measurements with the little folding ruler I keep in my pack. I called Pete on the radio. "Got something weird over here," I said. "Big tracks alongside our subject. Want a second set of eyes when we link up." "Wolf?" he said. "Bigger." There was a pause, and then he said, "Grizzly? Wrong shape." He was quiet for a few seconds. Then he said, "All right, mark it. We'll look at it together at the saddle." I marked it. I kept going. The trail climbed out of the creek bottom and switchbacked up the side of the drainage, gaining about 800 feet over the next mile. The forest changed as I climbed. The lodgepole gave way to a mix of fir and larch, and the understory thinned out. You could see further. That should have been a comfort, and it wasn't. The further you can see, the more there is to scan, and I found myself scanning constantly, the way you do when something in the back of your brain has decided you're being watched, even though the front of your brain is telling you not to be stupid. About 2/3 of the way up the switchbacks, I started noticing the trees. I don't want to oversell this. It wasn't dramatic. It was the kind of thing you'd miss if you weren't already looking. But on the uphill side of the trail, on probably 1 tree in every 20, there were marks. Vertical scrapes in the bark, about 7 feet off the ground, 3 of them in parallel, maybe a foot long each. They weren't fresh. They were old enough that the sap had darkened. But they were there, and once I'd seen one, I started seeing them everywhere. Bear claw marks run horizontal more often than vertical, and they're usually lower, 4 or 5 feet, where a bear stands on its hind legs to mark territory. These were higher and oriented the wrong way. I tried to picture what would make a vertical scrape 7 feet up a tree, and I couldn't come up with anything that fit. A bear standing fully extended could maybe reach that high, but a bear doesn't drag its claws straight down. A bear pulls. These marks looked like something had reached up and dragged its hand down the bark, the way a person would. I didn't radio Pete about the trees. I don't know exactly why. I think part of me was already doing the thing you do when you're working a search, and the evidence starts pointing somewhere. Your training doesn't have a folder for. You put it in the maybe pile and you keep moving, and you tell yourself you'll sort it out when you have more data. That's how it's supposed to work. You don't jump to conclusions in the field. You collect. There was one more thing about the trees that I didn't put in my notes that day and that I have not, until right now, told anybody about. On a couple of them, the ones where the scrapes were freshest, the bark wasn't just clawed. It was scraped clean in patches, the way you'd scrape it if you were trying to get at the soft cambium underneath, and there were teeth marks in the cambium. Not chewing, the way a bear works at a tree for the sap. These were single, clean impressions, like something had put its mouth against the wood and bitten down once and let go. I could see the individual tooth marks. They were not the teeth of any animal I knew. The canines were too long, the spacing was off, and there were too many of them. I counted on one impression and got, I think, 24. A wolf has 42 teeth. A bear has 42 teeth. A human adult has 32. Whatever had put its mouth on that tree had something in between. And the canines were the size of my pinky finger from the second knuckle up. I stood there looking at the impression for a long time, and then I made myself keep walking, because if I'd stayed I would have started taking photographs, and I knew even then that I did not want to have those photographs on my phone. I reached the saddle about 1 p.m. Pete was already there. He'd made better time on the North Fork because his trail was less technical. He had his pack off and was eating a tuna pouch with a plastic spoon. "Anything?" I asked. "Nothing. No sign. You?" I showed him the photos, the wrapper, the sit-down spot, the boot prints, the other tracks. He looked at the tracks photo for a long time. "That's not a wolf," he said. "No. Bear? Look at the toes." He looked. He zoomed in on his phone. He shook his head slowly. "I don't know what that is." "Me either." He looked up at me. "You think Resnick's still alive?" It was a question that wasn't really a question. He was asking me to commit to a frame. If I said yes, we kept searching with the urgency of a rescue. If I said no, we shifted to a recovery and we called in more resources. The honest answer at that moment was, I didn't know, and I told him that. "Let's keep going till dark," I said. "If we don't have him by then, we radio out and request a bigger team for tomorrow." He nodded. We ate. We refilled water from a spring just below the saddle. We talked about my daughter's birthday, which I told him I'd forgotten. And he laughed in the way you laugh when someone else admits to being a worse father than you are. He had 2 kids, both under 5. He was always tired and always cheerful about it. Good kid. We decided to push together down the east side of the saddle into the upper Cinnabar drainage, where the trail gets faint and most lost hikers eventually end up. If Resnick had come up the South Fork and gone over the saddle, that's where he'd be. We dropped off the saddle around 2:30. The east side is steeper than the west, and the trail switchbacks down through a stand of old larch, some of them 3 feet across at the base. The wind had picked up by then, and the larches were dropping their needles in showers of gold, the air full of them like a slow yellow snow. It was, and I'm going to say this and you can take it or leave it, the most beautiful thing I'd seen in months. I remember thinking that, and I remember the thought feeling strange because the rest of me, the searcher part, was tight as a drum. About a half-mile down, the trail crosses a small bench, a flat spot maybe 40 yards across with a little spring-fed pool at the back of it. People camp there sometimes. There was a fire ring, and around the fire ring, scattered in the duff, was Resnick's gear. His pack was there, frame intact, top lid open. His sleeping bag was unrolled about 10 feet from the pack, half in and half out of its stuff sack, like he'd been getting ready to lay it out for a nap. His stove was set up. There was a small pot on it with water in it, the water gone cold and a little scummed with floating needles. A book lay face down next to where he would have been sitting, a beat-up paperback of something by Cormac McCarthy. His phone was in the side pocket of the pack, dead battery. What wasn't there was Resnick, and what also wasn't there, and this is what got me, was any sign of struggle. The duff around the camp wasn't scuffed up. The pack wasn't slashed. The food bag, hanging from a branch about 30 feet away in textbook bear hang configuration, was intact. Whatever happened, it didn't happen in a way that left the kind of marks you'd expect. Pete crouched by the fire ring. "He didn't pack out," he said. "He didn't even pack up. No, he left in a hurry. Or he left thinking he was coming right back." Pete looked up at me. Same thing as the pole at the trailhead. I hadn't thought about it that way, and he was right. The pole leaning against the bumper. The pack open with the sleeping bag half out. Both of them were the actions of a man who thought he was stepping away for a minute. Going to take a leak, going to check something out, going to be back in 5. I started a perimeter walk around the bench. slowly, looking at the ground. About 15 feet beyond the fire ring on the downhill side, I found a single boot print in a soft patch of mud, vibram, size 11 or 12, headed downhill, away from camp, and about 4 feet to the right of it, parallel, was another one of those tracks, 7 inches long, pressed an inch deep, 4 toes, claws registering. The 2 tracks were heading down into the lower drainage together. I called Pete over. He looked. He didn't say anything. He just nodded slowly, and the cheerful, exhausted look he'd had at the saddle was gone. And what was on his face instead was something I'd never seen on him before, a kind of dialed-in stillness. He was a smart kid. He was reading what was in front of him. "How fresh, you think?" he said. "The mud's wet. Could be this morning, could be earlier. 24 hours, easy. Maybe less." He looked at me. "We follow. We follow. We followed." The tracks led us down through the larch stand and into a tighter, darker stand of fir on the lower bench. The light got worse fast. It wasn't full dark yet, but down in the trees on the east side of the ridge, with the sun already behind the saddle, it was the kind of dim where you can see 20 feet and not much further. We had headlamps. We weren't using them yet. You don't burn batteries until you have to. The tracks stayed together for about half a mile. Boot print, track, Resnick and the thing, walking down through the forest side by side. There was no sign of struggle in any of it. No drag marks, no blood. No scuffs that suggested someone had been pulled or pushed or fought. Just 2 sets of impressions, one human and one not, descending into the drainage like they were taking a walk together. I have thought about that part of it a lot since then. The walking together. There are explanations that don't require the supernatural. A predator stalking from cover, maintaining a parallel track, waiting for the right moment. That happens. Mountain lions do it. But mountain lions are quiet about it. And they don't leave deep prints in the mud right next to their prey's prints because they don't want their prey to know they're there. Whatever was walking next to Resnick wasn't hiding. It was walking next to him. With him. At the bottom of the drainage, the tracks crossed Cinnabar Creek again, at a wider, gravelly ford. On the far side, the boot prints continued for about 30 feet up the opposite bank, and then they stopped. Not faded out, not lost in harder ground. Stopped. Right in the middle of a soft patch where the next print should have been clear and obvious. The other tracks continued past where the boot prints ended. 3 more impressions heading up the bank, and then they too were gone, swallowed into the duff of the forest floor, where nothing tracks well. Pete stood at the spot where the boot prints ended for a long time. Then he said, "Where's the rest of him?" "I don't know. There's no scuff. There's no spot where he sat down. He's just gone." I didn't say anything. He turned to me. Could he have been picked up? Lifted? I'd been trying not to think it, and now he'd said it, and I had to think it. "By what?" I said. "That." He gestured at the tracks. I looked at the gravelly bank. The light was failing now, real failing, the kind where you'd be on your headlamp inside 10 minutes. We were a long way from the truck. We were a long way from the cabin. We were a long way from anywhere. "We need to call this in," I said. "Yeah, we need to do it before we head back, because once we start walking, we're not going to have a free hand." He nodded. He pulled out his radio. That's when we heard it. It came from up the drainage, behind us, the way we'd come. A sound I'm going to try to describe, and probably fail at. It wasn't a howl. It wasn't a growl. It wasn't anything from the catalog of sounds I have a name for. The closest thing I can compare it to is the noise a big diesel engine makes when it's idling rough, that low knocking vibration that you feel in your chest before you hear it with your ears. Except there was a voice in it, a throat. Something living was making it. And it was loud enough and low enough that I felt it in my sternum the way you feel a bass drum at a parade. It lasted maybe 4 seconds. Then it stopped. The forest stopped with it. Same dead silence I'd had at camp the night before. No wind, no needle fall, nothing. Pete and I didn't move. I don't mean we stood still on purpose. I mean, we couldn't move. My legs were locked. The part of your brain that's older than language was running the show, and the part that's older than language said, freeze. Maybe 20 seconds passed. The wind came back. A single fir cone fell from a branch overhead and hit the duff with a small thump. The forest started up again. Pete looked at me. His face was very white. "We need to go," he said. "Yes." "Now." "Yes." We went. We crossed back over the creek. We started up the trail toward the saddle. We did not run, because running on uneven ground in low light is how you break an ankle. And breaking an ankle 4 miles from anywhere with the sun gone, and that sound behind you, was not a thing either of us was going to do. But we moved. We moved as fast as you can move and still be careful. And we did not talk. And we kept checking behind us. And there was nothing behind us. Just the trail and the dark filling in between the trees. I want to tell you about the cold, because the cold is part of this. The temperature when we'd left the saddle that morning was probably 40 degrees. The temperature when we crossed back over the ford on the way up was, I would estimate, 15, maybe 12. That's a 30-degree drop in less than an hour in October in the Bitterroots, which doesn't happen. I have been a ranger in those mountains for 11 years. I know the weather. The weather does not do that. And it wasn't a front coming in. There was no wind shift, no pressure change in my ears, no cloud cover I could see. The temperature just dropped, the way it drops when you walk into a walk-in cooler at a restaurant. And it dropped in a localized way because by the time we were halfway up the switchbacks to the saddle, it had come back. We climbed out of it the way you climb out of cold water. The reading on my thermometer at the saddle, when I checked it later because I had to know, was 36 degrees, which was about what you'd expect for that elevation at that time of day. The cold had been in the bottom of the drainage with us, and it had stayed there. About halfway up to the saddle, Pete stopped, hands on his knees, breathing hard. "Did you hear it?" he said. "Of course I heard it." "I mean, did you hear it? The voice in it?" "Yeah, that wasn't a wolf." "No, that wasn't anything." He looked up at me. His headlamp was on his head, but he hadn't turned it on yet. And his face in the dusk was the face of a man trying very hard not to lose his composure. "What do we say," he said, "when we call it in?" That was the question. I'd been thinking about it the whole way up. What do you say? You say you found the camp. You say you followed tracks. You say the subject is missing, and the tracks suggest the subject was accompanied. You say what you can say without saying what you can't say. You leave the cryptid stuff out of the radio call because the radio call goes in a log, and the log gets read, and if you put Dogman or Wolfman or anything like that in an official log, you spend the rest of your career being the guy who put it there. We say there are large unidentified animal tracks associated with the subject, I said. We say we lost the trail at Cinnabar Ford. We say we need a larger team and a wildlife biologist on site at first light. That's it. That's it. He nodded. He turned his headlamp on. We kept climbing. We made the saddle a little after 7. From the saddle you can see down the west side of the ridge for about a mile, and the trail's a thin pale line through the larch. We could see all the way down to the bench where we'd left our tents that morning. The wind was rough up there, knocking at us, and the temperature had dropped into the low 20s. We stopped just long enough to make the radio call, and then we started down toward camp. That's when I saw it, not for sure. I want to say that. Not for sure. The light was bad. The wind was making the trees move. I was tired and scared, and my eyes were doing what tired, scared eyes do, finding shapes and patterns. But about a third of the way down the west side, in a clearing maybe 60 yards off the trail to our left, in a patch of open ground where the larch had come down in a blowdown years before, there was a shape, standing. It was taller than a man, not by a foot, by more. It stood on 2 legs. The proportions were wrong, the arms too long, the head set forward of the shoulders the way an ape's head is, but bigger, and the muzzle, I want to say muzzle, extended further than an ape's. It was looking at us. I couldn't see its eyes at that distance in that light, but I knew it was looking at us the way you know in a crowded room when somebody's looking at you from across the bar. I stopped walking. Pete bumped into me. He hadn't seen it. I didn't point. I didn't say anything. I just stood there, and the shape stood there, and we looked at each other for what was probably 5 seconds and felt like 5 minutes. Then it moved. Not toward us. Sideways. 2 steps, smooth, fluid. No shamble or lumber to it at all. And it was behind a stand of pine and gone. "What?" Pete said. "Keep walking." "What did you see?" "Keep walking. Don't stop. Don't run. Just walk." He kept walking. To his credit, he didn't ask again. Not right then. We made it down to camp by 8. We struck the tents and packed in a hurry. I'm going to admit that the hurry was not strictly necessary. The smart move would have been to stay in camp, in the spot we knew, with the radios and our gear set up, and wait for the team in the morning. The smart move would have been to make a fire and sit by it and not move. We did not make the smart move. We packed and we hiked the 4 miles back to the trailhead in the dark, on the radio half the way, and we got to the truck a little past midnight. Resnick's Subaru was still there. The pole was still leaning against the bumper. We didn't touch it. We got in our truck and we drove back to the ranger station, and we didn't talk much on the drive. I'm going to pause here for now, because what happens after the trailhead, what we found the next day with the larger team, what I saw 2 nights after that, and what I have come to understand about what's living in that drainage, that's a longer telling, and I want to set this down in one breath and not in pieces. But I'll say this before I stop. The forest changed the way I saw it that night. Not in some movie way where I became a believer in the supernatural. I'm still not. I don't have a category for what's out there, but I know it's out there. And I know it walked next to Caleb Resnick down a trail in the Welcome Creek Wilderness in October of 2022. And I know that when it stood in that blowdown and looked at me through the dusk, it looked at me the way one person looks at another, not the way an animal looks at prey, the way a thing that knows looks at another thing that knows. And the worst part, the part that I haven't told anybody until right now, is that when it moved, when it stepped sideways into the pines, I had the very clear feeling that it wasn't running away. It wasn't done with us. It was just going somewhere it could see us better. And it was taking its time, because it had plenty of time, and we were the ones on a clock, okay? So, I'm picking back up where I left off, the morning after we hiked out, because that's when the second part of this started. And the second part is where I stopped being able to tell myself it was anything I had a frame for. We got back to the station at about 1 in the morning. I slept maybe 2 hours on the cot in the back room. Pete didn't sleep at all, as far as I could tell. By 4:30, we were drinking coffee with the district ranger, a woman named Marta Reyes, who had been doing this job since I was in middle school, and who did not have time for nonsense from anybody, including me. We laid it out for her: the wrapper, the sit-down spot, the boot prints, the other tracks, the camp at the bench, the divergence at Cinnabar Ford, the sound. I left out the thing in the blowdown. I'd decided on the drive home not to put that in the official version. Pete didn't know I'd seen it, so he couldn't contradict me. Marta listened all the way through without interrupting. When I was done, she said, "Show me the track photos." I showed her. She looked at them for a long time on my phone, zooming in, scrolling between them, comparing. Then she handed the phone back and said, "I'll have Carl Suarez out here by 8. Carl Suarez is the regional wildlife biologist. He's based out of Missoula. He works mostly on grizzly recovery, but he knows tracks better than anyone in the Northern Rockies. If Carl looked at those photos and said they were a known animal, they were a known animal. By 8, Carl was there. He looked at the photos in person, and not on my phone. I'd had Pete print them at the office. He laid them out on the desk and put a ruler on each one and made small notes in pencil on the margins. He took maybe 20 minutes with them. Then he said, "These aren't anything I recognize." Marta said, "Could it be a deformed wolf? A hybrid?" Carl said, "Wolves don't get that big. We've had eastern timber wolves come down from Canada that hit 150 pounds. To press a track an inch deep in mud, that consistency, you'd need an animal closer to 400. And the toe splay is wrong. And the gait, if these are sequential, is wrong." "What do you mean the gait is wrong?" Carl pointed at the photos. "Look at the stride length. A canid that big. Walking, you'd expect maybe 30 inches between prints. These are running closer to 50. That's a bipedal stride length on a 4-toed track, which doesn't make sense because 4-toed bipeds are not a thing." Nobody said anything for a while. Marta finally said, "Could the prints be from 2 different animals? Front and back, not from the same body?" Carl looked at the photos again. "Maybe. But then where's the rest of the track sequence? If it's a quadruped, where are the other 2 feet?" She nodded slowly. She looked at me. "What do you think?" I thought about the blowdown. I didn't say it. I said, "I think we need a bigger team, and we need to be back in there by noon." We were. By noon there were 9 of us at the Welcome Creek trailhead. Me, Pete, Marta, Carl, 3 more rangers, and 2 volunteers from the Missoula County Search and Rescue. Resnick's sister had driven up too, but Marta had her stay at the trailhead. There was no good reason to bring her in further. We left her in the cab of a sheriff's deputy's truck with a thermos of coffee and the deputy himself for company. We pushed in fast, made the bench by 3. The camp was exactly as Pete and I had left it. the pack, the sleeping bag, the stove, the cold pot of water, the McCarthy paperback, the food bag still hanging. Nothing had been disturbed. Whatever had walked down to Cinnabar Ford with Resnick the day before had not come back to scavenge the camp. The team was a good team. The 3 other rangers were people I knew well. Mike Gallego, who'd been a smoke jumper before he came over to search and rescue, and who had the bad knees to prove it. Andrea Pomeroy, who was in her 2nd season and was, I had already decided, going to be running a district of her own inside 10 years. And Frank Witt, who had been doing this almost as long as I had, and who was the man you wanted next to you when things got weird, because Frank had been a corpsman in Iraq, and there was no version of weird he hadn't seen worse of. The 2 sour volunteers were a married couple from Bonner, the Holcombs, who did this for free, 2 or 3 searches a year, and who had the kind of relentless cheer that volunteer rescuers either start with or develop in self-defense. Marta walked us through the plan at the trailhead. Then we walked. The hike in felt different with a team. With Pete and me alone the day before, the drainage had been pressing in on us. With 9 people, headlamps on packs, radios chirping every few minutes, boots on the trail, the forest was just a forest. It looked the way it had always looked to me before. Sun coming down through the larch, the creek loud on the right, an osprey calling from somewhere over the ridge. I caught myself, halfway up to the saddle, thinking maybe Pete and I had spooked each other into a story. Maybe the tracks were a deformed wolf. Maybe the sound had been wind through a hollow tree. Maybe the thing in the blowdown had been a stump. By the time we crested the saddle and started down the east side, I was almost ready to believe that the previous 24 hours had been a stress reaction. That's how the brain works. It wants out from under what it can't carry. It will rewrite anything if you let it. Carl photographed the tracks at the ford from every angle he could think of. He made plaster casts of 3 of them. He took soil samples. He worked the way scientists work, slowly and without showing whatever was in his face. But I watched him while he worked, and the longer he worked, the more his mouth got into a particular shape, a kind of tight pursing that I'd seen on him once before, years ago, when he was looking at a partially eaten elk that didn't match anything he could identify. He didn't like what he was seeing. He measured one track twice, and then a 3rd time, and on the 3rd time, I saw him write the number down, and then put a question mark next to it, and then circle the question mark, and Carl is not a man who circles question marks. He is a man who deals in confidence intervals and known taxa. The question mark stayed in his notebook. I saw it again later when he was writing up his report at the trailhead, and it was still circled. We pushed on past the ford. The tracks were gone on the Duff side of the bank, just like they had been the day before. But we spread out into a search line, 6 abreast, 20 feet apart, and we walked it. We walked it through the rest of the afternoon, gridding the lower bench and into the bottom of the next drainage. About an hour into the grid, Andrea, who was on the far right of the line, found something. She called out for me without using the radio, just my name, and there was a tone in it that made everyone stop. I jogged over. She was standing at the base of a dug fir looking up. About 15 feet off the ground, lashed to a branch with what looked like a strip of green parachute cord, was a small bundle. A piece of folded canvas or oilcloth, about the size of a paperback book, tied with a single knot. Frank got over to us next and looked at it for a long time. Mike came over. We all stood there looking up. Nobody wanted to be the one to climb. Eventually Frank, who was the smallest of us and used to climbing trees, went up. He came down with the bundle and laid it on a flat rock, and we unwrapped it. Inside was a single object, a small carved piece of antler, maybe 4 inches long, with markings on it that I did not recognize, did not look like any Salish carving I had seen, and did not look like anything I had seen in any folklore book. The markings were geometric, deliberate, deep. The antler was old. The cord was new. Whoever or whatever had tied it up there had done so recently in the last few days, but the antler itself had been carved a long time ago. We did not know what to do with it. Carl bagged it. The bag went into Carl's pack. I have asked him in the years since what he did with it, and he has told me twice, on different occasions, that he turned it into the regional office, and I have checked with the regional office and they have no record of it. I believe Carl is telling me the truth. I also believe the antler is gone. Where it is now, I cannot tell you. We found Caleb Resnick at 4:12 in the afternoon, roughly half a mile from where his tracks had ended. He was alive. I want to repeat that because I know what the buildup sounded like. He was alive. He was sitting on a flat rock in the middle of a small clearing, his back to a fir, his hands folded in his lap. He was not visibly injured. His clothes were dirty, but not torn. He looked up when we came through the trees, and when he saw us, he did not seem surprised, or relieved, or anything I would have expected. He just looked at us. Pete reached him first. Pete is a kind kid, and he went straight to him and crouched down and said all the right things. "Caleb, are you hurt? Are you okay? Can you stand up?" Resnick did not answer for a long moment. Then he said, in a voice that was perfectly normal, the voice of a man who had not been missing for 3 days, "I'm okay, I'm just tired." The clearing where we found him was, I'm going to say, off. I don't have a better word for it. It was a small flat spot, maybe 20 feet across, ringed by dug fir and a few cedars. The duff on the ground was packed flatter than the surrounding forest, the way ground gets when it's been walked on a lot over a long time. The trees ringing it were the oldest in the immediate area. You could tell from the bark, deeply fissured, the kind of fir that's been standing 200 years. And in the center of the clearing, near the rock where Resnick was sitting, there was a pattern of stones. Just regular gray stones from the drainage, but arranged. Not in a circle, not in any shape I'd seen before, but arranged, 8 of them, in a slightly curved line about 4 feet long, each stone the size of a softball, each one placed with what looked like intent. I have thought about those stones a lot in the years since. They were not a cairn, they were not a fire ring, they were not anything I could identify. But somebody, or something, had set them there, and Resnick was sitting 6 feet from them with his hands folded in his lap. Carl saw them too. I caught him looking at them while Marta was on the radio. He didn't say anything, he just looked. Later, when we were walking out, I asked him what he made of them, and he said, "I'm not going to make anything of them." And that was the end of that conversation. Marta got on the radio to the trailhead and told the deputy to tell the sister we had him and he was alive. I watched Resnick while she did this. He sat very still. He watched us back. There was something about the way he sat that I couldn't place at first. And then I could. He sat the way a person sits when they're waiting for an interview to end. Polite, present, not engaged. We got him on his feet. He walked under his own power. We started back up toward camp, and on the way, I fell in next to him. "Caleb," I said, "can you tell me what happened?" He thought about it. He really did seem to think about it. Then he said, "I went for a walk. I got turned around." "You were missing for 3 days." "Was it 3 days?" "Yes. It didn't feel that long." He was looking straight ahead while he talked. He had a long, even stride, no limp, no hesitation. A man who had been sitting on a rock for 3 days does not walk like that. A man who hasn't eaten in 3 days does not walk like that. "Caleb, were you alone out here?" That one took him longer. He walked maybe 10 paces before he answered. Then he said, "I don't want to talk about it right now. Is that okay?" I said it was okay. I was a search and rescue ranger. I wasn't a cop or a therapist. My job was to get him out alive and let other people sort out what had happened to him. So I let it go. But I watched him. I watched him for the next 2 hours as we hiked back to the saddle and over and down to the trailhead. He never stumbled. He never asked for water. He drank when offered, but he didn't ask. He didn't talk to his sister much when we got him to the deputy's truck. Just hugged her once and said he was sorry he'd worried her. The deputy took him to the hospital in Missoula to get checked out, and that was the last I saw of him in person. The hospital reported him in good physical condition, mildly dehydrated, no injuries, no signs of trauma, blood work normal except for slightly elevated levels of something they couldn't immediately identify, which they sent to a state lab, and which never came back with a confirmed result, at least not one that anybody told me about. He was discharged the next day. His sister drove him home to Missoula. He never came back to the office to make a statement. He never returned the call I made to his sister 3 weeks later, asking gently if he'd be willing to talk to me. The sister said he was doing fine, but he didn't want to talk about it. She said it in a way that made me understand that she had asked, and he had said no, and she had decided to honor that. So, I had a found subject and I had no story. What I had instead was Carl's report, which came out 4 weeks later, and which I am going to try to summarize without doing violence to it. Carl identified the tracks as belonging to an unknown large mammal, probably bipedal, based on the stride length and the absence of accompanying tracks from a fourth limb, with foot proportions inconsistent with any known North American species. He stopped short of saying anything more than that. Carl is a careful man. The report went into a file. The file went into a cabinet. I have not heard the report referenced in any official capacity since. What I also had was the thing in the blowdown, which I had told nobody about, which I had told myself was a trick of the light and a tired brain, and which I had almost succeeded in believing. 2 nights after we brought Resnick out, I was at my cabin, which is a one-room thing on a piece of national forest land about 12 miles from the station. It's not on a road. You drive in on a service track for half a mile, and then you walk the last quarter mile. The cabin has a propane stove and a wood stove and a battery system for the lights. No phone, no internet. That's how I like it. I was lying in my bunk reading when I heard footsteps outside. I lived alone. There was no reason for anyone to be there. The nearest neighbor, if you can call him that, was a logger who lived 3 miles down the valley. People didn't come to my cabin uninvited because people didn't know where it was. The Forest Service did not advertise the locations of staff cabins. The footsteps came around the side of the cabin and stopped at the front porch. I sat up. I reached for the rifle I keep next to the bunk, a Marlin lever action in 30-30. I worked the lever quietly. I got up and stood with my back against the wall next to the door. I waited. I waited a long time. There were no more footsteps. I started to think I'd imagined the first ones. The cabin makes noises. The wood contracts in the cold. Branches fall on the roof. I was wound up from the search and from the thing I'd seen and not seen, and I was probably hearing things. I waited longer. I waited maybe 10 minutes. Nothing. I let the rifle drop to my side. I exhaled. Something on the porch took a breath. It was loud. It was close enough that I could hear the air going in through the nose and the small wet movement at the back of the throat that bigger animals make. It was right outside my door, 6 feet from where I was standing, separated from me by half an inch of pine board. I did not move. I did not raise the rifle. The animal brain part of me that had locked my legs in the drainage 2 nights before locked them again. I stood there and listened to it breathe, and I thought very clearly, if it wanted to come through this door, the door wouldn't stop it. There was no part of me that was thinking about whether to shoot it. I knew, the way you know without being told, that shooting it would be the wrong move. Not because it would miss, but because it would be the move that ended the arrangement. Whatever the arrangement was, an arrangement was happening, and the breathing on the other side of the door was the first half of it. It breathed maybe 4 more times. Slow. In, out, in, out. Each breath had a slight rattle to it at the end, like a man who'd smoked his whole life and was breathing through that damage. Then it stepped back. I heard the porch board creak. Then I heard a single step on the gravel of the path. Then the night was quiet again. I stood there for, I don't know, half an hour. The rifle got heavy. I set it down. I sat down on the floor with my back against the wall, and I sat there until first light. And I did not sleep, and I did not move, and I just sat there. When it was light enough to see, I went out on the porch. There was a track in the soft dirt at the edge of the porch boards. Just one. 7 inches long, 4 toes, claws registering, pressed deep. I went back inside. I made coffee. I sat at the small table by the window, and I drank the coffee and I looked at the trees, and I tried to figure out what was happening. Here is what I had come up with by the time the sun was fully up. The thing in the drainage, the thing in the blowdown, the thing on my porch, knew who I was. It knew where I lived. It had walked 12 miles, or more likely it had moved in some way I don't understand, from the Welcome Creek wilderness to my cabin in 2 days. And it had stood on the porch and breathed at me through the door, and it had left a single track to make sure I knew it had been there. It was a message. It was not a threat. If it had been a threat, the door would have come off the hinges. It was a message that said, I know you saw me. I know where you are. We are not done. I want to tell you that I called Marta the next morning and reported it. I didn't. I want to tell you that I took the rifle and went looking for it. I didn't. What I did was, I drank my coffee, and I drove to the station, and I worked my shift, and I did not say a word to anyone. The reason I didn't, I have thought about a lot. The simple version is, I was scared. The longer version is, I had started to understand something about what we'd walked into in that drainage, and I was not sure that the standard rules of who tells what to whom applied anymore. Here's what I started to put together over the next few weeks. The Welcome Creek Wilderness has a history. I'd been working it for 11 years, and I'd never bothered to look into it, because rangers don't generally read history books about the forests they work. But after the porch, I started reading. I went to the library in Missoula. I went to the Historical Society. I read everything I could find about the area. The Salish people knew that drainage. They had a name for it that translates, depending on who you ask, as the place where the long-faced walkers live, or the place where you don't camp. Salish elders interviewed in the 1940s for a WPA project described tall, fur-covered beings that walked upright and looked like a mix of man and wolf. They said these beings were not animals and were not spirits. They were a third thing. They had treaties with certain families. The treaties were honored on both sides, and the families could pass through the drainage safely, and the beings could pass through the family's territory safely. And nobody bothered anybody. Through a contact at the tribal college in Pablo, I was eventually put in touch with a man named Joseph Lemire. He was a Salish elder, then in his late 70s, and he was, I was told, one of the few people still alive who'd been taught the old stories in the old way by his grandmother, who had been a child when the reservation was still being defined, and who had remembered the drainages the way her grandmother had remembered them. Joseph agreed to meet me on the condition that we meet at his kitchen table in Arlie, and not at any kind of official setting. He made fry bread while we talked. He did not look at me much. He said his grandmother had called the things in the Welcome Creek the old neighbors. He said the word in Salish, which I will not try to spell, and then he said it again in English, old neighbors. He said his grandmother had told him that the old neighbors had been there before the Salish, and they had been there before whoever had been there before the Salish, and that the agreement between the Salish and the old neighbors was very simple. The Salish did not go into certain places at certain times, and the old neighbors did not come into the Salish camps. The agreement was kept by both sides mostly. He said the word mostly, and I let him say it without asking what he meant, because there was a way he said it that told me I did not want to know. He said the miners had broken the agreement in the 1870s and had been punished for it. He said that the white people who came after the miners had been left alone, mostly because they had not gone into the places at the times. He said that the agreement was, in his understanding, still in force, but that the old neighbors were not what they used to be. He said he did not know what they had become. He said the world had changed around them, and they had changed too, and he did not know in what way. I asked him if he had ever seen one. He looked at me then for the first time, with eyes the color of wet bark, and he said, "I have not been in those places at those times." That was the closest he came to answering. I asked him what I should do, given what had happened to me, and he thought about it for a while, and then he said, "Stop reading the Bible book about the angels. That book is not about what you have seen. The book about what you have seen has not been written, because the people who knew what to write did not write it down. They told it to their grandsons." He gave me a piece of fry bread to take home. I ate it driving back up Highway 93 at sunset, and I cried a little, which I had not done in a long time, and which I am not embarrassed about. The miners who came in during the 1870s didn't have any treaties. There are accounts, you have to dig for them, in old Montana newspapers of miners disappearing out of the Welcome Creek and Cinnabar Creek areas. The disappearances stopped after a few years, and the prevailing theory at the time was that the miners had gotten spooked and moved on. The Salish elders who were still around at that time said something different. They said the miners had gotten the message. In 1906, a forest ranger named Henry Pellegrini went into the Welcome Creek wilderness on a routine patrol and did not come out. A search party found his horse. They found his rifle. They found his hat. They did not find him. The case was closed as lost, presumed deceased, and the Forest Service moved on. In 1948, a deer hunter named Roger Klemp shot what he claimed was a large, hairy man-like animal in the Cinnabar Creek drainage. He brought back a photograph. The photograph was published in the Missoulian and then was lost or destroyed, depending on which version of the story you read. Klemp himself was found dead 2 weeks later in his cabin near Lolo. The official cause was a heart attack. He was 34 years old and had no history of heart trouble. In 1972, 3 hippie kids on a camping trip in the Welcome Creek told a Forest Service ranger that they had been visited at their fire one night by a tall figure that they described as more wolf than man, but standing up. They said the figure had not threatened them, but had stood at the edge of the firelight for several minutes and then walked away. They said the figure had appeared to be holding something in its hand that looked like a piece of bark with marks on it. They had not been able to see the marks clearly. The report is in a file at the regional office. I read it. There was more in that file than I expected. Once I started looking, I found 6 other reports of similar encounters from the same area between 1960 and 2010. A logger in 1966 reported seeing what he called a man-shaped bear cross the road in front of his truck near the Cinnabar Creek Bridge. A pair of fly fishermen in 1983 reported a tall, hairy individual standing in the creek about 100 yards upstream from them, watching them fish, and then turning and walking up the bank into the trees without splashing, which they specifically noted because they had been making plenty of splashing themselves and the water was knee-deep. A woman from Stevensville in 1997 reported that she and her husband had been hiking the trail to the saddle when they had felt watched, had turned, and had seen what she described in the report as a creature that was almost a man but not. Her husband, who had not seen the figure, refused to corroborate. The case was closed without further action. There were others. Most were closed without further action. None of them had ever been collated, as far as I could tell. They were just sitting in a file folder labeled Miscellaneous Incident Reports, Welcome Creek Cinnabar Drainages. The folder was an inch thick. 3 of the reports in that folder had been logged by the same ranger, a man named Wendell Brokaw, who had worked the district from 1978 to 2004. He'd retired the year I came on, and I'd never met him, but I knew the name from the bottom of old paperwork. I tracked him down through the union directory. He was 81 years old, living in a double-wide outside Hamilton, with a daughter who picked up the phone and asked who I was twice before she'd put him on. When I told him what I was calling about, he was quiet for so long I thought we'd been disconnected. Then he said, "Took you long enough." That was the first thing out of his mouth. I drove down to see him the next weekend. He sat in a recliner in a living room that smelled of pipe smoke and arthritis cream, and he told me, without ever using the word, that he had encountered the same thing I had, 3 times. Once in 1981, once in 1989, and once in 1996, all within the boundaries of the Welcome Creek and Cinnabar drainages. He said the first time he'd radioed it in and been told, in so many words, to never radio it in again. He said the second time he'd kept it to himself. He said the third time, the time in 96, he'd been alone in the lower Cinnabar with a sprained ankle, and the figure had come to within 30 feet of him and stood there for what he estimated was 20 minutes and then walked away. And he had decided that day that he was done with the back country, and he'd spent the last 8 years of his career on trail crew and visitor services. I asked him if it had ever come to his house. He looked at me for a long time. Then he said, "Once, that I know of. Why, has it come to yours?" I told him it had. He nodded. He said, "Then you already know what I'd tell you." I left him with my phone number and told him to call if he wanted to talk again. He never did. He died about 14 months after our visit. His daughter wrote me a note. The note thanked me for coming. The note also said, and I have kept it, that her father had been calmer in his last year than he had been in any of the years she'd lived with him, and she did not know why. But she suspected it had something to do with our conversation. I have not known what to do with that information either. I read other things too. I read the Book of Enoch, the non-canonical one, the Ethiopian text, the one that the Christian and Jewish traditions don't include in their main Bibles, but that has been around since before the 1st century. The Book of Enoch talks about the Watchers, 200 angels who came down from heaven and took human wives and had children, and the children were the Nephilim, the giants. But there's a section, the Book of the Watchers, that describes the Watchers themselves, and it describes them as taller than men and shaped strangely and able to take different forms. Some of the older Jewish and early Christian commentaries on the Book of Enoch suggest that the Watchers, after they were punished by being chained in the desert, were not all chained. Some were left to wander. Some made arrangements with the places they wandered into. The commentaries don't say where, but they say it. I read about the Cherokee too, because the wildlife biologist out of Missoula, the one I'd shown the photograph to, had mentioned offhand that there were similar stories in the southeast. The Cherokee have a story about beings called the Nunahi, the people who live anywhere, who were said to be tall and to walk between worlds and to make pacts with certain places where they could be approached and certain places where they could not. There are similar stories in the Ojibwe tradition, the Wendigo, though the Wendigo is usually described as something else, something hungrier. There are stories from the Iroquois about the stone coats, There are stories from the Hopi about the Bow clan and the warriors who came down from the mountains and were not human but were not gods either. There are stories from the Inuit about the Tornid. Every culture that has lived next to a wilderness has a story like this. I am not the first person to notice that. People who study folklore have been noticing it for 100 years. The official line in academic folklore is that these stories are how pre-scientific cultures explained dangerous predators or unusual humans. The unofficial line, the one you'll hear from old anthropologists at the end of their careers when they've had a few drinks, is that there might be something else going on and that we should maybe stop being so sure we know what's in the woods just because we have GPS now. I'm not saying any of this is proof of anything. I'm saying that when you sit at a kitchen table in a one-room cabin in Montana and try to make sense of what you have seen and heard and what walked up onto your porch in the middle of the night, you start to look at every story humans have ever told about tall things in the woods, and you start to notice how many of those stories share certain shapes. The walking upright, the not quite animal, not quite human face, the arrangement, the treaty, the way they leave you alone if you leave them alone. The Salish stories and the Book of Enoch and 100 other traditions I'd never paid attention to. They were all describing something, and that something fit very neatly into the shape of what I'd seen in the blowdown. I don't know what it was. I want to say that one more time. I don't have a name for it that I trust. The internet wants me to call it a dogman, and I have read the websites and I have looked at the photos that other people have posted, and some of those photos look like what I saw, and some of them don't. I don't want to use that name because the name has been used so much that it has become a label, and labels make things smaller. What I saw in the drainage and what walked onto my porch was not a small thing. What I think it was, and I am only saying what I think, is a being that has been in those mountains a long time. Longer than the Salish, longer than anyone. I think it lives by some kind of agreement with the place. And the agreement involves not bothering people who don't bother it, and bothering, in some way, I do not want to think about too clearly people who do. Caleb Resnick bothered it. I do not know how. I do not know if he stumbled into a place he shouldn't have, or if he did something at his camp that the being took notice of, or if the being just decided, the way these things apparently decide, that it was going to walk with him for a while. What I know is that it walked with him from his camp to the ford, and then something happened, and 3 days later, we found him on a rock with no memory of how he got there and no interest in talking about it. He has not, as far as I'm aware, gone back into the woods. His sister told me, when I called her one more time, in the spring of 2023, that he had given his camping gear to a friend and bought a fishing boat and now spent his weekends out on Flathead Lake, on the water, where you can see in all directions and nothing tall comes up behind you. She said he was doing well. She said he didn't talk about it. I have gone back into the Welcome Creek a few times since. I have to. It's part of my district. I go in during daylight. I do not camp there. I have not had another encounter, and I do not look for one. The Welcome Creek Wilderness is a beautiful place, and the trail along the creek in the early morning is one of the prettiest walks in western Montana, and I try to remember that. And I try not to think about what is in the drainage on the other side of the saddle. The footprint on the porch was still there the next morning. By the morning after that, a rain had come through and it was gone. There has not been another. The thing has not come back to my cabin. I do not know if that is because it got what it wanted, which was to be acknowledged, or if it is because I have not, since that night, told anyone what I saw. I will say one more thing about the cabin, and then I will leave it alone. About 3 weeks after the porch visit, the logger who lives 3 miles down the valley, a man named Dale Hessler, came up the service track in his pickup looking for me. Dale is the kind of Montana neighbor who comes by maybe twice a year, usually to ask if I've seen a stray cow or to drop off a bottle of huckleberry preserves his wife had made. We're not close. We're cordial. He sat in his truck with the engine running and rolled the window down and said, "You been hearing anything weird up here lately?" I asked him what kind of weird. He said, "Big weird." He told me that 2 nights before, he'd been out on his porch finishing a beer around 11, and he'd seen something cross the service track about 400 yards from his place in the moonlight, walking on 2 legs, taller than a man, headed up the valley. Headed, he said, toward my cabin. He'd watched it cross. He'd gone inside and locked his door, which he had not done in the 31 years he'd lived on that property. He said he'd thought about driving up to check on me, but he hadn't, and he wanted to know now if I was all right. I told him I was all right. I told him I had not seen anything. I told him he had probably seen an elk standing at an angle in the dark. He looked at me through the open window of his pickup for a long beat. He has a face like an old saddle, all weathered creases and patient eyes. Then he said, "Yeah, probably an elk." He rolled the window up and backed his truck down the service track, and I have not seen him since, though I have heard, through the grocery store grapevine in Lolo, that he sold his property the following spring and moved to be near his son in Spokane. People sell property in Montana for a lot of reasons. I'm not saying I know why he did. I'm saying that what he saw that night, 2 nights after he saw it, was on my porch, and that I was not going to be the man who confirmed it to him, because confirming it to him would not have helped him sleep, and his wife was not well, and he had enough on his plate without me adding the words, "Yes, you saw what you thought you saw," to whatever was already in his head, until now. I am telling this now because I am retiring at the end of this season. 32 years in the Forest Service, 11 of them in this district. I am 61 years old, and my knees are not what they were, and my wife wants me home, and it is time. And before I leave, I wanted to put this down somewhere, because there have been other rangers who saw other things in these mountains and never told anyone, and I think their not telling has cost us something. I think there are people who go into the Welcome Creek every year who would benefit from knowing what's in there, not so they can go looking for it, the opposite, so they can leave it alone. If you are reading this and you are planning a trip into the Welcome Creek wilderness or into any of the deep drainages of the Bitterroot Range, here is what I would ask of you. Stay on the trails. Do not camp in the saddles between drainages. If you hear something at night that does not sound like anything you know, do not investigate. Stay in your tent. Do not go looking for what made the sound. If you feel in the middle of a perfectly ordinary day that you are being watched, you probably are. Turn around. Go back the way you came. Whatever it is will let you. It is not interested in confrontation. It is interested in being left alone. And if you should ever, by some chance, see one of them really standing in a blowdown or at the edge of a meadow or anywhere it should not be, do not run. Do not raise a weapon. Do not shout. Stand still. Look at it once, briefly, the way you would acknowledge a stranger across a wide room. Then turn and walk and do not look back. It will not follow you. It does not need to. It already knows where you live, the way it knew where I lived, the way it has known where every one of us has lived since before our great-grandparents were born. That is the arrangement. Honor it. I am still here. I am still in my cabin. The forest outside is the same forest it was 11 years ago. The trees do not lean any differently. The wind through the pines does not say anything I can understand. And every once in a while, on a still night, when the wood has stopped creaking and the propane has stopped hissing, and there is no reason on earth for there to be any sound at all, I think I hear something take a slow, deliberate breath outside my door. I do not get up to check. I do not open the door. I lie in my bunk and I listen until the breath has gone. And I think about Caleb Resnick on his rock. And I think about Henry Pellegrini's hat in the snow in 1906. And I think about the Salish elders and the long-faced walkers and the watchers in their thin chains in the desert. And I close my eyes. And I am, in the end, grateful. Grateful that I was let pass. Grateful that the arrangement, whatever it is, held for me. Grateful that whatever stood in that blowdown and looked at me through the dusk decided that I was a thing that could be left alone and let me go. I hope, if you go into those mountains, that it lets you go too.